Hey friends, on the day after, well, the day we're recording is the day after the summer solstice. Michael Martin in our diocese, we are under the patronage of St. John Fisher, whose day is today. So it was kind of a solemnity.
The
I was
English
at mass
Martin.
with the bishop. Yeah, and I guess what I didn't know until this morning is that he took his name from John the Baptist, but that it's pretty cool that his birthday too, he had such an identity with John the Baptist, he chose that. Also, which is going to tie into our guest's work today, both of them, John the Baptist and St. John Fisher, had run-ins with powers of state, and things didn't necessarily end well anyhow. And I just thought it was fun that because of John the Baptist, St. John Fisher, and the day after the summer solstice, I think all those things kind of vibe with each other.
And what is it, 2 days before St. John's Day?
Yeah.
Right?
Yep. You might have heard I left my parish. I was running the local parish, and I'm working with the diocese now. But right before I left, I got these two people just to have on their property, way off in the woods, a huge bonfire Saturday night. So it's going to go on a parish event for St. John's Day.
So
we're going to do an equally huge thing for Michaelmas. Our guest today is Bill Cavanaugh, and many people will know his name. His work aligns pretty well with a friend we had on the podcast recently, Eugene McCarraher. And Bill, I think one thing I want to say about you is, well, how we met is a friend of mine, our little college, SUNY Geneseo, had one theological lecture a year, and it was an ecumenical committee. That doing things by committee is always tricky, but we'd have to agree on a speaker. And I always thought it was kind of, we did lowest common denominator things. That's kind of what evolved. Well, there was a new Episcopal priest in town, and I hadn't met him, but I knew he was invited to a meeting to talk about that year's lecturer. It was called the McVitie Lecture. And I saw a certain shade of green in his hand as he was walking in. And he was carrying a book, and it had a certain shade of green, a certain shade of green. And then I recognized the book as your The Migration of the Holy. And I thought, I'm going to side with this guy. So sure enough, he was the new guy. Nobody could accuse us of kind of being in cahoots, but he wanted to put your name forward as the lecturer. And I said, sounds great. And so we finally got a great speaker, and it was Bill Cavanaugh. And I took you to the airport after that fine lecture. We had dinner the night before. After that, Bill, you came to the Abbey of the Genesee, because on that lecture, you met one of the monks, Father Isaac. Then you'd been up to the Abbey of the Genesee. And then we've also met through a couple of book discussions, like Zoom ones, one of your work, Church as Field Hospital. But I also want to say one more thing about you, Bill, before, if people have read your work and they haven't met you. To read your work in its totality is to think that meeting the author, he would be like, in the evening, he'd be hanging around with the people you'd meet in the pages of Dostoevsky's The Possessed, or The Devils, anarchists. He'd be hanging around with people whose names are like Pyotr Trofimovich and Stavrogin, because his work is revolutionary, borderlines on the anarchistic. And yet when you ask Bill, and I've had the pleasure of knowing him several times, like, what are you doing tonight, Bill? I'm just going to pick up my kids from cross-country practice. I'm going to go to a cross-country meet. So Bill, your work is very, very, very revolutionary, always has been. And I think your demeanor somehow hides that a little bit, and it probably works to get your work out there, because it's a ticking time bomb in a wonderful, wonderful sense. So welcome, Bill Cavanaugh.
Thank you, Mike. That's a really nice way of saying that my work is interesting, but I'm kind of dull, really.
Hardly. So Bill, we're speaking to, you're in and around Chicago.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah,
you're the author of a number of books. I'm going to try, I think between different offices I have, basically all of them are there. I don't know if I currently have in my possession Church's Field Hospital, but Torture and Eucharist, Being Consumed, The Myth of Religious Violence, the Migration of the Holy, Church's Field Hospital, probably some other ones in there. And you're working on a book on idolatry that's going to be coming out when?
I should be getting the proofs pretty soon, so it should be out by the fall.
Very exciting, very exciting. I kind of want to begin, Bill, by, we're not going to stay on a strict chronology of your work, But last week we were, and it'll be posted soon, we were talking with our friend Guido Preparata, who used to teach at the Gregorian, and a guy, Eric Wilson, who is very brilliant. He's a historian, studied at Cambridge, but he's really trying to get into, how mafias work, where political murder is used and why people use it, what its results are. And, when in the discussion, Michael, you remember this, that David Hume wrote an essay called the myth of the original contract, or the social contract, that we create these kind of beginnings that are formed in myth, and we think it started there. But we're all kind of coming to the conclusion that corruption has been warped into government from the get-go. But your book, Torture in Eucharist, let me say two things. One is your work is, it could be a 3-year series in itself on the bishop's move towards the Eucharistic revival. Eucharist features, Bill and I were just talking to that prior to coming on air, but you're doing something really important in all of your works. It's in the title of Torture in Eucharist. It's there definitely in Being Consumed. But you do really neat things with ecclesiology. But in Torture in Eucharist, you set up kind of two counter structures. And with the incarnation, with Jesus coming into this world, we have a different way of being, and can you kind of describe what you're doing in Torture in Eucharist? Because it's so relevant to the Eucharistic revival, and it's even going to verge, you'd be the most interesting person to talk to with people like Patrick Deneen now in the post-liberals, It's just a fact. It's just a fact. Describe your thesis in Torture in Eucharist as you would say it now.
Yeah, so it came out of my experience of living in a poor area of Santiago, Chile, in the last years of the military regime in Chile. And so the two movements so it was my PhD dissertation, which became my first book. And the two basic movements are torture, which is a way of kind of individualizing, atomizing the body politic. The point of the regime was not to get everybody marching together, but rather to individualize everybody. Pinochet brought down Milton Friedman after the coup in 1973 to restructure the whole economy. So based on the idea that it's just a collection of individuals. And so you do away as best you can with intermediary groups like political parties and labor unions and so on. And so torture is this attempt to get everybody to stay away from one another, to put the fear of gathering into them. And then Eucharist is this opposite movement of bringing people together into a body. And so that's the basic contrast in the book, how the church learned to be oppressed and learn to kind of knit the body back together. The church became the kind of only place left where you could gather in Pinochet's Chile. And so kind of looking at that through the lens of Eucharistic theology.
It's interesting, especially you see over the last, we went through lockdown and Easter and Christmas were canceled. And I don't know about you, Bill, but I still do now, but at the time I had 4 younger children in the house. I think my youngest at the time was 9. And it was torture for them. It really was torture for them. And they couldn't go to church, right? So, I mean, I think what you're saying resonates with our experience of that, because I to this day, I know my 2 daughters in particular, they're now 20 or almost 20 and 18, absolutely traumatized.
Yeah. Right. We're not meant to be kept away from each other like that.
Right.
Yeah. I have a priest friend who says that torture and Eucharist are the 2 principal parts of the Mass. First, there's the homily, which is torture, and then comes.
You know what I read? Here's just a rando thing, and I don't know how much the Russian Orthodox Church I read, and it was from a Russian, that prior to the Communist Revolution, this makes sense. So even if it's not apocryphal because it wasn't written with that, but they did away with the homily for about 100 years, like in the early 1800s. And then they needed it again to catechize, I think, afterwards. But the rationale was, why do they do something naturally so divisive right before the liturgy of the Eucharist? Isn't that a brilliant insight? Totally brilliant, totally brilliant. I've always said, get away the homily, for like 20 years. Just, we need more quiet time. But anyhow, Bill, Michael's saying something really important. And I was thinking too, that, some people would say towards the end of the Roman Empire, when we're looking at civilizations in decline, we don't have to be too apocalyptic about our own, but it certainly has a lot of the earmarks of decline. Is that one way of describing what happened is people started, I could say it now, I almost feel more a part of the church, even though the church is going through one of its periodic deaths, than I do maybe as an American citizen, right? So people in the decline of the Roman Empire thought that their identity with the Catholic Church just became the more lived, the more real identity, as the other one kind of faded. And this notion of ecclesiology, have you been engaged with these kind of new post-liberals like Deneen and Gladden, Papin, and so forth? And like, what do you say about what the case you're making? It's almost, Jesus breaks into history. Jesus can do it again. The church can be there, versus this, what I'm taking is almost an imposition on top. Because something we haven't mentioned, Bill, is again, your PhD roots are with John Milbank and people like Stanley Hauerwas.
It's actually not with John Mill. I mean,
okay, not at all. I'm sorry.
I read Milbank's book in grad school, and that theology and social theory, but didn't meet him until later.
Okay, gotcha.
Didn't study with him.
Yeah. How do you see your work vis-a-vis what the post-liberals are doing?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I mean, a lot of Deneen's criticisms of liberal order, I think, are right. They're a little bit overgeneralized, maybe, but they're right. But I don't see a lot of ecclesiology. He's not a theologian, and I don't see a lot of ecclesiology. And so he has found an attraction in people like Viktor Orban, and that I find really problematic. Right. So instead of the church being the kind of primary loyalty that you're talking about, it's still the nation state, just in a different and somewhat more dangerous guise, and that I find difficult. I like Patrick. He and I have crossed paths several times, but not my. I think we're going in opposite directions at this point.
Yeah, and I think what you're doing is much more interesting. I find it much more hopeful. It seems to capture from the bottom up, it seems to capture the mystical notion of the kingdom of God that was preached as the central reality of the gospel and so forth. But do you see more people engaging with this post-liberal thing, working from viewpoints? So I think Michael and I would both like to promote like a viewpoint kind of similar to yours. Do you see other interesting theologians who are taking that on with something like what you're talking about in Torture and Eucharist, this kind of lived reality of church?
Yeah, I mean, there's the folks in the Ecclesia Project that I've been close with. I gave a talk last summer on the Little Way, Dorothy Day and Teresa Lisieux. And they're really interesting folks. And that was kind of created by Mike Buddy and a few other people maybe 15 years ago as a way of bridging academic discourse on these matters with pastors and people in the pews. And so there's a lot of people that are trying to kind of live this out at the parish level. How do we regard our primary loyalty as being to Jesus and resist the idolatries of primarily the nation and the market? And so there's a lot of hopeful stuff that's going on at the grassroots. The Ecclesia Project with 2 Ks. If anybody wants to look that up online, a lot of good.
I'll certainly link to it in the description. Who are the figureheads of the Ecclesia Project? I guess I've heard the name. I'm embarrassed to say I don't know. That's why I was asking you a question, like, where do we turn to for other models than this one? We see through the problems of the nation state. Nobody's more hard hitting than you. But the answer isn't just a different form of this kind of top-down oppression.
Right. Yeah. These are really interesting folks. I would really recommend looking them up. And so it's a network, a kind of loose network of it's very ecumenical. It's Catholics and Protestants, but it was founded by Michael Buddy. I don't know if you know.
Yeah, I've seen the name.
My friend and colleague Michael Buddy, but he's my colleague here at DePaul and a good friend, Catholic political scientist, and he just had a book come out last year called Foolishness to the Gentiles, which is a lot about Christian formation as opposed to the kind of formation that we get from the nation state. So always a bracing read. I was reading it recently, and I just said to my wife, "Boy, nobody out pessimists Mike Buddy."
I think we'd like him, wouldn't we, Michael? Yeah.
You would definitely like Mike Buddy. You should have him on your podcast.
Oh, definitely will. Definitely
He's
will.
awesome. He's really great.
I'm glad to hear there's people out there like it. I'm just kind of embarrassed of myself that I've heard the name, but haven't, it was just kind of revisiting your work that, it was only a couple of weeks ago that the, Deneen's new book, I guess it's just putting it straight there. Like, this is what we're about. It's Orban and so forth. We knew that's where they were leading, but I'm as uncomfortable as you are. And so, worth the price of admission already, Bill, for coming on the podcast. Michael, you've engaged with Bill's work over the years. What would be some of the?
Well, I'm interested. When was it? When I was working on the submerged reality. What year did Migrations of the Holy come out?
Oh, maybe 2010, 11, something like
that. So people were pointing me to your work, which is when I first picked it up back then, because the sacramental view you point to is the key to reality in there. I think is important. But what I'm thinking about now, hearing you talk, I mean, when you talk about the Ecclesia Project, I mean, so the question I have been struggling with actually for a while now is, what is the church? Because as you're talking, I'm hearing also in my head, and I'm sure Mike was too, our buddy Guido Preparata, who's got a forthcoming book, Church and Empire, which is a book about precisely I don't know what to call the church, but the Catholic hierarchy's complicity in the world order, right? At times, right? So let me ask you that. So how would you define the church?
Yeah, it's the body of Christ with a lot of very sinful members, right? So when I talk about the church, I don't primarily mean the bishops. Right.
But that's what people think about it right away, right?
It is, right. And that's exactly.
Is.
That's what we've been taught to think of when we think of the church. Mm-hmm. But we need to take a more Vatican II kind of view of it. And so when we talk about the church, we mean us, right? We who have been called into this body and need to make the most of it from the bottom to the top of the hierarchy, right? I think Pope Francis has tried to emphasize this a kind of decentralization of the church, and for most of the church's history, it was a lot more decentralized than it is now, right? I mean, at the beginning of the 19th century, only a handful of bishops around the world were directly appointed by the Pope, and by the end of the 19th century, they all were, right? So there's been this tremendous kind of centralization in the church, and I think Pope Francis is trying to kind of call us to a more decentralized view on that. And people like, lay saints like Dorothy Day, I think that's what that was her version of personalism, right? Don't look for somebody else to do it yourself.
Exactly.
Right? Don't complain about the church. Go be the church.
Right. And I was actually driving. I was delivering vegetables today, and I was thinking, about our upcoming discussion, and that was one of the questions that was kind of living in me. Is so I remember when I abandoned my career as a Waldorf teacher to get a doctorate. Part of my the impulse leading to that was that I could see what so this is a long time. So I was late to get my doctorate. But I could see where things were heading culturally, because I can see how, for instance, the work of Judith Butler was so insidiously present in academia, right? And I knew, well, this is gonna, the end game for this is it's gonna percolate into the culture in a kind of half-baked way, and it's gonna ruin a lot of things, which is what it did, right? And so I wanted to be part of the anti-that. I did. And that was part of it. That was part of my impulse to do it,
I think we need T-shirts that we are the anti-that.
I do. That's what we're gonna start.
That thing that's
we're against it.
Yeah.
But I think it was a failed project. And that's why, because I don't know if you don't know my story, but Bill, but the college the liberal arts college I was teaching at abruptly closed in 2017.
Which college is this?
Mary Grove College in Detroit, Michigan.
Okay.
And we got our contracts at the end of July, and the first week of August, they told us the place was closing at the end of the fall semester.
Oof. Oh,
it was rough. But I, because of all that, but also my experience in academia, there was a lot living in me that was saying, what good are we doing besides talking to each other? How do we make a difference? We can talk academics, we're all good at talking, but how do we actually, build the kingdom?
Yeah. Oh, I'm sorry. Is that a question?
Yeah.
Oh, okay. Let's talk about that some more.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it starts with talking, right? I mean, wasn't that what Dorothea Day said? We were just sitting on it. That's the way she ends The Long Loneliness, right? She said we were all just sitting around talking when, somebody came in, and the next thing you know, we had a house of hospitality and so on. So nothing wrong with talking. I think it starts with talking, but I think you're right. We need to kind of do more than that and build bridges. I think this podcast is one way of doing that, right? Building bridges between academia and pastoral work, and the kind of things oftentimes in my work, I'm trying to kind of hold up examples of what people are actually doing at the grassroots. And there's a lot of good stuff going on. There's no shortage of that. So I think people need to do serious intellectual work. And I'm really glad that, I'm in academia and have the, possibility of doing that. But I'm always trying to write for a broader audience and trying to be as clear as I possibly can. I sometimes tell people that I got kicked out of radical orthodoxy for writing too clearly.
I hadn't heard that one. That's a good one.
Yeah.
We've the first time, again, when you gave that McVitie lecture, I remember driving you to the airport, and I'd mentioned that for maybe 20 years I'd just been devouring everything and anything by Yvonne Ilitch, and you started asking about Ilitch, and I know subsequently you started diving deep into him, but on the church, it's not like he had it figured out, but in one place he says, and I use it with young people all the time, not to disrespect the bishops or anything, but that entity that takes its nourishment from the Eucharist. That's pretty cool, right?
Yeah.
It gets us focused. And the other one is, he has the helpful distinction between, as opposed to saying, look, those horrible people over in Rome and us real progressive types who are on the right side of history, he had the church as it and the church as she, but he had a lot of respect for the church as it, this kind of, ossified and necessarily conservative structure. It's like the skeletal system of a human body, that without the skeletal system, the ticking time bomb of the Gospels, wouldn't have been protected, so that they're still here to set off their dynamite every so often. And then the church as she, is that the fluid more part. And again, I could pull a hair from my head, like the former abbot of the Abbey of the Genesee would do in front of students, or take a hair and say, like, where do I end? And there's some mystical notion there. And, I think all those are getting to a piece of it, that we don't have to be grateful for certain people The other thing I think is in Rochester, we had a famous priest, good guy. His name was Jim Callan, and he was a prophetic figure, but he went so far, and then Bishop Matthew Clark had to just kind of separate the church as, being beyond the pale. But when I think of Yvonne Ilitch himself, and a hero of mine that we need to do a podcast on was Lamennais during the French Revolution.
Oh.
Lamennais was with the church, and radical individuals kind of tied to the church is a neat engine. I don't want to self-identify as radical. That can be very patronizing and so forth. But I don't think, and I'm not necessarily talking about the church as it, Michael, but I think if I wasn't kind of wedded to an institution that was somewhat inherently conservative, it's just going to move slower, like the skeletal structure, I'd probably be spouting more insane stuff than I already do. I don't even know what I'd be thinking, right? I need personally to be somewhat tethered to something like that. Now, Lamennais, he was the most read person, Catholic writers at that time by far. He was a radical. He said everything. He was singled out in 2 papal encyclicals saying everything you're teaching is wrong. Now everything he taught was right, but he had to separate himself from the church, and he did become pretty far out at the end of his life. I kind of like that late stage Lamennais too. But when we talk about the church, I tend to, and very influenced by torture and Eucharist and being consumed, that I tend to go for kind of a lower ecclesiology, a more living thing, as that entity. You have house church, Mike, you're still part of that entity that takes its nourishment from the Eucharist. Bill mentioned the Ecclesia Project, which I have to look into more. It's an ecumenical undertaking, Yeah. But Bill, talk about how you describe Eucharist, through the lens of your book, being consumed. You're doing something I think better than most people who at Christmas time are just talking about consumer Christmas, right? It gets very old.
That's right.
You're trying
Sales
to be
are down this season.
Yeah. Yeah, that was like many of my books it was just started as a collection of essays, but the first chapter of that book, it's only 100 pages long, the whole book. The first chapter is about the so-called free market. What do we mean when we're talking about the free market? And so I argue that there's no such thing as the free market as such. The real question is, when is a market free, right? When is it actually contributing to the flourishing of people, and when is it not? So you need a criterion of freedom that is more substantive than just lack of government interference, letting corporations do whatever they want. That real freedom is kind of what leads to human flourishing. And so I kind of eventually get to talking about consumerism as a kind of false freedom in that sense. It's a sort of detachment from production. It's a detachment from producers. It's a detachment from the products themselves, right? We're detached. We don't make anything ourselves. We are detached from the people who make our stuff, which live on the other side of the world. And we're detached from products too, because we can't get attached to anything. We need to, throw them out and move on, right? We got to get the next iPhone and that sort of thing. And so a kind of rootedness, which is based on a different model of consumption, is what I'm after. And so I look at the Eucharist as this kind of being consumed by the body of Christ, right? Augustine says, here's the voice of Jesus saying, eat of me and you will not assimilate me to your body like the food your body eats, but I will assimilate you to my body. And so it's this kind of being sucked up into this larger body of communion with other people that kind of turns what we usually think of consumption inside out. And so that's what I'm after in the book.
I still think it's great. Like your work it's a great catechesis for the Eucharistic revival. That idea of being sucked up reminds me of John Zazoulis's definition of the Eucharist as the memory of the future,
right.
Which kind of moves in that same direction. All of us kind of being called up to that thing.
I mean, I'm glad that the bishops are calling attention to the Eucharist, but I'm afraid they're doing it in a sort of one-dimensional way, and kind of trying to renew reverence for the miracle of the presence of Jesus. And I think, I mean, I believe fully in the real presence of Christ in the Eucharist, but then the whole question of therefore what, and how does this make a body not just on the altar, but make a body out of the church, the
Mhm.
other meanings of the body of Christ, that I'm afraid is being neglected. I hope I'm proved wrong.
Well,
But
I
I'm
think
afraid that,
that
yeah.
that points to what you
Your worry
mentioned
is
earlier,
mine. Yeah, Michael. Yeah.
what you mentioned earlier, Bill, with at the beginning of the 19th century, the bishops were not chosen by the Pope. At the end, they were, or is it the 18th? But it's the same kind of thing, and I think probably maybe one of the problems we see in the Catholic Church right now is that it's so top down. And if you go to the Middle Ages, and my doctorate's in early modern English literature, you go to the Middle Ages and the early modern period and the Corpus Christi festivals, which were one of the most important feast days of the year,
Mhm.
which is, it goes by and we don't even notice anymore. But that was something that was from the grassroots up,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah, I think that's right. The Pope used to be court of last resort, and then over the course of the 19th century became CEO of Church Incorporated.
Yeah.
Right. And it's the same with the bishops, really, too, that a pastor is a shepherd, doesn't drive the sheep like you drive a car, right? I mean, a shepherd is just there to kind of keep the sheep from straying and protect them from wolves and so on. But the pastor is not meant to, the shepherd is not meant to kind of run things, drive the sheep like you drive a car. And so there's definitely a role for Pope and bishops, but the rest of us just need to take the initiative. And if we stray too far, there's somebody to kind of call us back. But there's a lot of work to be done, and it's really not the bishop's job.
You're so clear on this stuff. I think it's really awesome. It was I've taken it many times, but I think and probably pretended it was my own without clarifying it. But I think I heard it in an Alexander Schmemann talk, but he was just, I had an old audio cassette. It was something on the Eucharist, and he was just mumbling and goes, I don't know of any presence that's not real. So what does the word real add to presence? And that, I just think you're very eloquent on it, Bill, because we're not disrespecting it at all. But it just feels like they want to add another real on to real presence. That's the catechesis, like it's really real.
Really, really real.
Yeah. And I thought, so let's keep the word real, but I've shared with Michael, I like playing them in prayer. I like playing with all those words in my head. Like, how about a real absence? That's pretty cool. And then a present real. I kind of like that too. But all these things, but it's just like real presence, that's now it's floated off. It's one of those, say the word shoe 100 times and the word kind of floats off.
Yeah,
and
right.
I think, for so many people, the way it's being used, the real presence in so much of the literature around this Eucharistic revival, which is a good thing, is going to have that same effect on people, and so your work re-embeds it. It gets us out. And again, your work on the nation state, let's start moving there a little bit, because I'm sure you see it, but to an outsider like myself, your work is always of a piece. People who've read all your work, it's really fascinating to see where you're going. And, we have a goal here, Michael and I, to talk to you today about a lot of your work, then to have you on again, right, when your book on idolatry comes out. But, you kind of move from Torture and Eucharist, and Being Consumed was probably even written after The Myth of Religious Violence, or no, Bill?
Gosh, I can't remember exactly. I mean, it was written piecemeal before,
Okay.
and then I think it came out in English in, I don't know. No, actually, I think it came out before The Myth of Religious Violence.
Yeah. Well, so tell us, you wrote a book called Because Your Experience, Torture and Eucharist.
Mhm.
Then, The Myth of Religious Violence, it's that was the kind of the subject. I think it still might be that basic kind of talk is what you're best known for, that kind of give us your thumbnail sketch of what you were doing there, but it certainly follows organically from your work Torture and Eucharist, because you're
Yeah,
telling the story that's kind of like you're telling an disenchantment story. How would you describe that?
it actually came out of a paper that I wrote in grad school. I was taking a political science class, and we kept reading. It was a political theory of liberalism class with Professor Tom Spraggins, and we were reading Richard Rorty and John Rawls and Judith Shklar and all these people that kept saying that the liberalism came out of the wars of religion, where you've got Catholics and Protestants killing each other, and so the state has to come along and move the Christians to the punishment corner and take over. And it just seemed absurd. I mean, if you look at it, just even a cursory view of the history, you see that the 30 Years' War, most of it was Catholic dynasties, the Habsburgs versus the Bourbons, fighting it out. So it wasn't Catholic versus Protestants, it was Catholic, and so on. So that became a chapter in my book, Theopolitical Imagination, and then eventually came and expanded it into this book.
But you say that
Religious
basic thing,
violence.
what we call the wars of religion. I think you say there, it's the wars of the burgeoning nation state. But that is taken axiomatically by everybody. I mean, that is a religion drilled into us. You're saying it's absurd, prima facie absurd, not to 99.9% of the people, Bill. I mean, they've been certain. Yeah, okay.
Yeah,
it's still
absolutely.
a very radical talk you give. Keep going.
It's the Ur myth. It's the Genesis story, really, of liberalism, of modernity. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so basically what I do in the book is argue that people kill for all sorts of things, gods, but also flags and oil and freedom and the workers' revolution and so on. And if you look at the history of the term religion, this religious secular distinction is a modern distinction. And one that applies really only to the West until it gets imposed on the rest of the world through colonialism. And basically it comes because it's a way of marginalizing the church. The church is about religion, which is inherently dangerous and therefore needs to be privatized. And then there's this other thing called the secular, which is just kind of mundane and this worldly, and that's essentially peaceful or essentially less violent,
as we can see.
As we can see, right? Right. I mean, yeah, just like old Joe Stalin, right? An atheist regime. So in order to make that work, you have to do things like what Christopher Hitchens does, where he says, "Oh, Stalin, yeah, even though he was an atheist, that counts as religion too, because totalitarianism."
Right.
So basically, you just take all the things you don't like and you put them into the category of religion, and then everything that you do like ends up in the category of the secular.
There was a BBC series, or maybe it was just one or two, because I haven't checked the numbers lately, but it was on the Inquisition. So it wasn't from Word on Fire Institute or something, but I think they were saying through the whole history of the institution, you're more likely to die in the civil courts than you were in the religious courts. And I forget what number they used. They might have said those people who were actually killed might have been like 3,700. And at that point, you could say Obama and Trump killed more with drone strikes alone than were killed in the totality of the Spanish, right? But some of these numbers, like if we get into body counts, let's keep updating them. But like the story you're telling is so important, right?
Oh my gosh, yeah, no, like you hear it all the time, right? The Spanish Inquisition, over the course of 350 years, between 3,000 and 5,000 people.
That's my understanding, yeah.
Which is about how many the Khmer Rouge killed every 3 days.
Yeah.
Right.
Yep.
So I mean the myths of and Jose Casanova actually talks about this too and wonders why it is that this myth is so popular in Europe and other places in an age where it's so unlikely that somebody is that these kind of battles between Catholics and Protestants are centuries in the past. Mm-hmm. And yet the story lives on today because it's an important story. because it, justifies certain kinds of arrangements of power.
Yeah.
It's a kind of Oedipal rage too, right?
Yeah. Well, yeah. That's a good point.
That's
Right.
what I think a lot of people do is for whatever reason they get mad at Daddy Church and they just dump all this stuff in that direction, and you see that a lot. I don't know if you've seen it, but I see it with a lot of younger, well, maybe not younger anymore, but they used to be younger Catholic bloggers who are just nuts. And it looks like and I keep telling them when people ask what I think, I said, it's like a giant Oedipal rage thing. I don't know what it is, but it's disturbing. I mean, they still identify as Catholic, but their rage is so, uncontrolled, so over the top.
I used to experience the phenomenon.
They tend to hate me, but
but which ones are you thinking of, Michael, in this case?
a lot of them on Pathos.
Okay. Yeah. Gotcha.
Aren't they all? I mean, they're just just crazy to me.
Yeah, it could be like every evil stems from there.
Well, a lot of them, and this is, I don't want to talk inside baseball, but I think a lot of them went to Franciscan University.
And then kind of reacted against Franciscan.
And they're letting it rip.
That is kind of a subset. People who kind of broke free of what they saw as a kind of a Steubenville quote.
Yeah.
And, I mean, cult. And but Bill, when you came and gave that talk at Geneseo, but when you say it's still kind of out there, I think the same thing you're trying to explode in the myth of religious violence is something. It wasn't this year, but to do campus ministry on a state university is to do the obligatory like panels, like once a semester. Some club would want all the different faith groups to show up at the college union, and they would ask us like our feeling on, being kind to animals, and okay, Mike's a Catholic, what do you think? I think our tradition tells us we should probably be pretty kind to animals, and the Jewish guy says the same thing. But I had to stop doing them. But the one time it was really great because a person upset the apple cart. They did it the same type of thing they were doing, and it was on all the traditions and the use of story. So they had a Buddhist guy, and he kind of told a koan, and then the Jewish guy told a great story from like that Martin Buber had related in some story of the Hasids, and a Muslim guy told a great story, and then the Christians were represented that time by a Mennonite. And it's how people are ready for what you're saying, Bill. So the Mennonite guy got up there, and he just didn't play according to the rules. He goes, I got a story, and it's called the Bible. And the Bible says, unless you believe in Jesus Christ, like you're going to spend a long time in like burning fire and so forth. And the students, so the board of the Interfaith Center and the college came out, and they were running up to every young person, just thinking how their ears and their whole, and every young person loved the authenticity. They didn't necessarily believe them. It wasn't the same way I would tell the story as a Christian, not at all. Yeah. But seeing every young person for whom the baby boomers in this case, and I can single out the baby boomers, but they were just there, so mortified at what took place. Every young person there was just like, finally, somebody spoke their mind, and they were hungry for it, right? Yeah, but I'll never forget it. I've got a story that's called the Bible, and it says this. Really, really great. So the myth of religious violence, is that still a talk you're called upon to give frequently, Bill? Because it's
yeah, I still give it every once in a while. I was just in Norway in December. They had a conference on religion and violence, and they asked me to do the keynote. It was interesting. It's a group called it's like the Council for Religions and Life Stance Communities in Norway. Yeah. And so this includes, the humanists and lots of people that are not considered generically religious. So that was interesting because they kind of got the point that I'm trying to make, which is that, everybody believes in something. And so the question, don't tell me about, believers and unbelievers, everybody believes in something. So the real question is, tell me what you believe in, and I'll tell you what I believe in, and then we can have a conversation, and we can do that without killing one another. So so that was useful in that
people
way.
Are waking up to that. The younger generation is waking up to the fact that everybody has a metaphysics, everybody's working from a blueprint, and that's where I think your work, I'm so glad to be kind of as they say, foregrounding it, because the post-liberal option becomes a real one for people. That Orban makes sense, in one sense, when you realize that the language of the naked public square was always something of a conceit. But let's move from the myth of religious violence onto, it's a very easy to follow progression, but it's super important. It's a whole from below apologetics, if you ask me, your body of work, to the migration of the holy. So you're telling that story, different from Eugene McCarraher and before him, in one sense. How do you describe how you want to tell that tale? You mostly focus on the nation state as he focuses on the market, right?
Yeah, right. Although they're really interrelated,
Mm-hmm.
right? Yeah. So the migrations of the holy is a term that I borrowed from the historian John Bossy, who talks about the migration of the holy from the church to the
theater.
Right, Leo or Louis the 14th and so on. And so you get this all these kind of liturgies surrounding kings in the early modern period and so on, and that then just becomes sacrificing for the nation state in the modern era. So that's the story that I've been wanting to tell, throughout all of my work, really, is this idea that everybody, worship doesn't just go away in the so-called secular age, but it just migrates to other places. And I focus particularly on the state and the market. And that's actually where I'm going finally with this book that's coming out now, The Uses of Idolatry.
Mm-hmm.
I start with the novelist David Foster Wallace's quote from his famous commencement address to Kenyon College. Do you know this?
I do.
Yeah.
My brother-in-law went to Kenyon while it was the
is
year
that
before he
right?
gave that talk. Yeah.
Oh, 2005.
Yeah.
But he says, in the trenches of everyday life, there's no such thing as atheists. Everybody worships. And the reason you might want to worship a god is because everything else you worship will eat you alive. Worship your looks and you'll always feel ugly. Worship money and you'll never have enough, etc. And so that's what I'm looking at in trying to work that out in a scholarly way, that insight out in this new book, The Uses of Idolatry, it's called. So it's but trying to do it sort of sympathetically, right? It's not just a Jeremiad against everybody else is an idolater, everybody except me. But trying to see idolatry critique as a way of sort of leveling the playing field between believers and unbelievers, right? That everybody believes in something. So let's just talk about what we believe and talk about the things that devour us, right? Everything else will eat you alive. Talk about the kind of structures that we've created, especially capitalism and nationalism, that are human-made structures that are eating us alive. So I start off with Max Weber and argue that even he doesn't buy this idea that we live in a disenchanted world, and then work my way through Charles Taylor and the Bible and Augustine and Jean-Luc Marion and nationalism, consumerism, and then the final chapter is on sacrament as a kind of incarnation and sacrament as an antidote to idolatry. And I have actually a little gentle criticism of Gene McCarraher in the final chapter, because his antidote is the Romantics. And it's a kind of vague idea of the enchantment of the material world. And I argue that, if disenchantment is the problem, then that's good enough. But if misenchantment is the problem, as McCarraher says, then we got to talk about which divinity. It's not good enough to talk about, investing divinity in material things. The question of which divinity is really important. The Romantics were, the nationalists in the 19th century were Romantics. And there's Colin Campbell's book on the romantic origins of consumerism and consumer culture. So it's not good enough to just talk about romanticism, you got to do theology, which is what Gene. He's not a theologian, and so he's kind of leaving that to the theologians.
Well, yeah, that's a great
a little
point.
gentle nudge on that.
Now, you probably know this, but Mike, I know Mike knows it, but that's what the big debate with the German Romantics was with Novalis and his book Christendom or Europe, right? Where it was left unpublished when he died. And he died when he was only 30 or something, 29 or 30 when he died. And I think, I can't remember which of his friends was going to publish it, but they didn't want to publish what he was really said because it was so pro-Catholic, so Christian. We always get a nostalgic for the Middle Ages, but it was, and it was always thought, you know, he was looking at Goethe. So Goethe at the end of Faust, right, with the Mater Gloriosa, the Virgin, the divine feminine that leads us ever onward, which is about as Catholic a notion as you can get. And Novalis was heading in that, was already writing in that direction, but died before it could happen. So it's interesting. But on the other side, you see Schiller, who kind of went toward nationalism, right?
Yeah, right.
And so that was why in my book, The Submerged Reality, I called it the noble failure of romanticism.
Ah, well, you must have had an interesting conversation with McCarraher then.
Yeah, I mean, we're, you know, as people are, we're so taken with his writing, and like the vast majority of his book is so needed that I don't, and we're not afraid of ever taking umbrage with people, but did that come up, Michael? Not as clearly as it might have.
No, we didn't get that explicit about it.
Yeah.
But I mean, that's, but
I
Bill,
go ahead. Yeah.
Interested in, you know, I'm kind of pro-romanticism, but in the way I just described.
Yeah, right. Oh, me too. I mean, right. It's just like, which romanticism?
Yeah,
that's the question, right? Yeah.
Well, just like anything, you can look at the Catholic Church and say the same thing. Which Catholic Church?
Right. Yeah, exactly.
Right.
Yeah.
But Bill, you know, your quote that you just kind of called to memory, you know, it's, I only singled out, you know, when we're talking about idolatry, you know, it's going to tie in Michael's work on sophiology. Is going to have a lot of phenomenology, you know, but it's, you know, for the listeners too, if the problem is disenchantment, then a more general concept of sacramentality is perhaps sufficient. If the problem is misenchantment, then the specification of which divinity will take on a greater urgency. That's the quote you were calling to mind, but that is, it's seminal. And I think, you know, when I was in grad school, and I don't know, maybe it was like a super progressive place back then, but sacramental theology did focus on the kind of the 7+2, you know, the human nature of Jesus and the church as sacrament.
Mm-hmm.
You know, right now, I think when, again, I'm going to go back to the Eucharistic Revival, there's a lot of talk of sacraments, but it's those 7, you know, because 7's a really cool number, 77777. But, you know, without understanding those 7's origination in the sacramentality of this different, you know, ecclesial project called the church, I think we're kind of stuck in some of these old apologetics. But, you know, say even a little bit more about, if the problem is disenchantment, then a more general concept of sacramentality is perhaps sufficient. If the problem is misenchantment, then specification of which divinity will say more about that. I think it's very hinge. It's hinge.
Yeah. So the idea that Weber put forth, not very aggressively and just in a few places, was that, you know, we live in a kind of disenchanted world. And I try to show that not only is that not true, but Weber himself didn't even believe that. He talked about the way that, you know, the capital and the state kind of take on this life of their own and come to react back against us and oppress us. And kind of, he talks about many old gods ascend from their graves. That's why I wanted to name the book Many Old Gods, but Oxford University Press changed it on me.
Bad bastards.
So
That's right.
Yeah. So
we can run them down pretty good.
I got some problems with you people.
Exactly. So disenchantment is not the problem, right? It's misenchantment, which is a term that McCarraher uses, which I think is exactly right. That it's just falsely enchanted. You know, capitalism is full of its own enchantments and so on. But if that's the case, then it seems to me like he's going to need to do better than just appealing to romanticism and the kind of instilling this sense of divinity in the material world, because that's what the marketers are already doing, right? And so and you know, I mean, this is at the end of a 900-page book or whatever, so you can't fault him too much for not, you know, giving us like a full account of what the alternative to this is. But he gestures towards this kind of sacramental world, but he's trying to be as ecumenical as possible, and so he calls on the romantics to, you know, if for something that would appeal not just to Christians but to other people. And I think that's all great. But ultimately, you're going to need to ask the question of which God are we talking about here? And so I make a case for the incarnate God.
That's actually that's the same point I made in the Submerged Reality, is that was the noble failure, is they couldn't.
Oh, is that right? Okay.
They couldn't ground it in the tradition.
Yeah, right.
Michael, but like, so remember last week when we had Eric Wilson on, but, you know, we were talking about, you know, that from the beginning, the hurly-burly, you know, everything's mixed up. You know, the mafia is mixed up with the founding fathers, not the Italian mafia, but like interests are, you know, and so then we create these myths of the founding and so forth. But all of a sudden, this guy was brilliant, Bill. You know, you'll see that podcast. It's worth listening to. The main guest there had some audio problems. We'll see how damaging they are. But all of a sudden, Michael's like, what's left? And the guy goes like, suicide. He's not a nihilist, he's an Orthodox Christian. But again, your ecclesiology, and I'm so grateful you mentioned the Ecclesia Project, because again, like you're not devoid of hope. You know, you're saying this thing happened. It's there. You know, we can rebuild the church. I forget what I was going to ask Michael, but it's the
Is it about Eric?
Maybe. It was about like you know, how kind of deadening that was. And this sounds so much different. I guess I did it not too many times, but I lost my train of thought on that.
Yeah, suicide's not a good thing. That was not an option. I just want to say, but and it's interesting though. I mean, what you're saying, Bill, and what Gene was, how he ends his book. I mean, it's kind of a stumbling toward, not you, but I think what we're all seeing this is we want an experience of the sacred, right? And I mean, I think it's just innate in human beings. You want that, right? And in my work in sociology is, you know, is deeply connected to the arts and creation. That's part of the reason I'm a farmer, is where you can see the goodness of creation. You can see you know, Sophia, or you know, God shining through, the wisdom of God shining through, and people want that, and that's what I think when people contact me after they read my books, like, that's what I'm looking for. But I think you make brilliant points that there's so much in our culture that is anti that, you know, that it's hard to find, right? And then I think,
are you anti that?
Yeah, this is getting tricky. Yeah.
So
he's an anti-communist. He's an anti-capitalist. He's always anti.
Am I anti that? Yeah. Whatever it is, I'm against it. That's right. But so where was I going? Now I'm losing my train of thought. No. So but when you're talking about idolatry, I mean, and the active part of idolatry is fundamentalism, right?
Right. That's one of the
people
kinds,
have to
right?
defend.
Or what Owen Barfield called a literalism, right?
Yeah. I mean, we all want an experience of the sacred and the divine, but we all want it on our own terms, right? And that's what idolatry is. It's what Marion calls the low water mark of the divine. It's a genuine searching for the divine, but it's a wanting that divine, or not being capable of anything else. It's wanting that on our own terms, right, or twisting it into our own terms. That's when it inevitably kind of reacts back against us to oppress us, right? Yeah.
And that's what's wonderful. Really inspiring to me about Marion's work is showing how the same object could be either an idol or an icon.
Yeah, right, exactly. Yeah.
I'm thinking too of if we're talking about kind of this re-enchantment or the correct enchantment, this notion, so we need ascetic disciplines that people can kind of look at things and see. Again, a tree is an icon. There's certain things in mass culture, maybe those pieces of writing produced by Chat GPT. But Bill, like, what do you think is the, I tend to think when we come to this watershed, that we need to train people in sophiology and a sacramental view of the world. I tend to think we probably need to tie, again, higher ed to some type of ascetical self-discipline, which isn't necessarily daily mass, but daily mass at its best is a training in this type of vision. But in addition to, I always think a complementary one. Over the weekend, my wife and I finally watched that movie, The Jesus Revolution. Have you guys seen it?
I just watched it last week. Yeah.
It's pretty cool that the guy ended up being a narcissist, right? Because we're watching him and he's kind of cool, but we're like, are the directors like so stupid that they don't see that this guy's kind of annoying? Do they think this guy's really cool? But it's based on, so it's a little bit of a subtle movie. But again, in the 60s, this is a point that Yvonne Ilitch makes in his essay, Philosophy, Friendships, and Artifacts, right? Because artifacts are not sacramental, but the way he's using them. But he said, as the 60s generation thirsted for justice, and it's kind of there in that movie, but also just there's a real thirst. When we look at the Catholic Church right now, and Ilitch, I think he wrote this, I forget what year, but he knew it was starting to come. And this is what I can say from, say, 25 years in campus ministry. As the 60s generation thirsted for justice, what young people are thirsting for now is friendship, right? And I have a feeling that, because we're talking a lot about the church, and the church is kind of, and the Eucharist, this new social body coming to life. And when we come to this kind of place where we all are about Bill's work, McCarraher's work, Ilitch's work, we've had Mark Vernon on talking about William Blake. When we say, like, what are we going to do? I've said this a couple of times, I use it with a lot of young people, but and I've mentioned at least 5 times on this, that for me, young people in an era where they're so anxious and out of control, they're using so much of what the church has to offer, whether they're ortho bros or rad trads or somewhat in between, but they're collecting arcana, they're collecting kind of mystic stuff. And, and the church is loving this, saying, oh, this is the sacred. And I'm starting to get allergic to that, because these same people who are collecting all this knowledge, that Maximus the Confessor said this, and there's these sacramentals, none of them have friends. And they're using this to create, it's out of loneliness, and they collect all this data. And a lot of it's for posturing. How much esoteric lore can you accumulate? So I think, that's the easy path. But the 2 paths the church needs to take is leading people into friendship. We all know there's, a loneliness epidemic, the likes we've never seen. But also, is there an ascetic discipline that can teach people phenomenology? We had a couple of weeks ago, he was fabulous, Bill. Martin Shaw, is that a name you're familiar with?
It's not.
He's a storyteller in Great Britain, and he's running with the likes of Paul Kingsnorth, who we've had on the show, and some others. And Martin Shaw is kind of a recent convert to Orthodoxy again, right, Michael?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, but he was, I was asking him, like, we have a local grad school, St. Bernard's, which you're familiar with. I think you're in the diocese, Bill. And they were in my new position. They were going to ask me, like, what they can do. And we asked this guy, Martin Shaw, and he said, teach phenomenology. And his ascetical self-discipline is like, Bill, this weekend, come up with 12 secret names for a tree outside your house. He's starting to get at something, don't you think, with this idea of idolatry?
Well, that, to me, that was, discovering that phenomenology. If you look at the great phenomenologists of the 20th century, they all came to a religious turn, or maybe not all, most of them came to a religious turn because something happened, right? And you even see that, and with Derrida, of all people, who I read one I think it was a conference or something, where he said, I'm just trying to do phenomenology as honestly as possible. That's what, and even at the end of his career, you could definitely, there's a way to say what he was moving toward apophatic theology, right? But you see that in Marian, you see it in John Paul II, you see, Edith Stein, Husserl, they all get there. And I think it's, and that's the thing, and I try, when I'm in the classroom, which is not very often, I try to get students to learn how to pay attention. I mean, even if they just notice, one thing I would often do is one time I happened to have a piano in the classroom, where I was assigned, and so I played on the screen on the public address system. I played the Beatles' "Hey Jude," and then I played it on the piano and sang. And I certainly don't sing as well as Paul McCartney. And I said, "What's the difference?" And they've never thought about that. And then I played it again, and they saw which one was more alive, and it spoke to them. And it wasn't like a great performance or anything, but just that experience where if we don't learn how to pay attention to what is before us, and I think this is probably one of the beautiful, no, I'm not a person who does this, but I think this is the people who are drawn to Eucharistic adoration, for instance. That's probably what they're doing, right?
Yeah, interesting.
Some are just so severely OCD, right? I mean, again, it's just, I happen to know if you take adoration at the church and the college students, some are there, yes, and we think it can lead to that, but we also have the scrupulosity. But I think almost to kind of tie this back, let's say Bill Cavanaugh, we've all kind of agreed to a narrative of misenchantment, your work on the migration of the holy is doing something like the naked public square thing, right? And so we have all these different streams coming together, and this post-liberal option has become a real live one. It's going to be, I couldn't fault people for young guys if they're just going to go that way, because they're seeing through something, and it's probably an easy solution to a complex problem. And I've played a lot with your book. Again, we want to have you on again when your book comes out. What do you think the church could be doing now? And we've talked a lot about the Eucharistic Revival, like kind of practically, you as Bill Cavanaugh, what do you think we can do with young people or just with the church?
Yeah, it's a huge question.
Huge.
But one of the things that I found works pedagogically is an exercise in asceticism. I've taught a course on Christianity and consumer culture, and we do an experiment where for 3 weeks we give up meat and sugar and sex and tobacco and all kinds of cell phones and internet usage and all of these different ascetic practices for a 3-week period. And the students who survive it, it's a voluntary thing, find it life-changing. There's one young woman who said she hadn't heard birds chirp in years, and then went around without her earbuds in, and this was a revelation. A friend of mine recently was teaching St. Vincent of de Paul, and the students really liked his attention to the poor, but they were really turned off by this idea that he spent 4 hours in prayer every morning. And so one of the students who was making this objection, my colleague said, "You've got an iPhone, right?" And she said, "Yeah." I said, "It's got one of those things that can track how much you've used it in the last week." Right. So they called it up, and she had spent 35 hours on her iPhone over the last week.
That's a good one.
A part-time job.
Yeah. That's how you can spend 4 hours in prayer. So yeah, I mean, some kind of ascetic practice mixed with a sort of attention to people in need. I think that is incredibly appealing.
Do you think we had a great guest on? I think he's the best new writer at Front Porch Republic, and he went after Deneen too. If you kind of Google it, his name is Adam Smith, and
not that Adam Smith.
No, not that. But he too at his maybe, what was the name of his university in Iowa? Do you remember, Michael? was really small. But anyhow, he had a dorm and he was gonna do something similar. Living techno fast for about 3 weeks or so forth. Do you see this as growing, Bill? Do you think it could possibly be something that would hit critical mass? I'm not talking about like a program that gets a brand name or anything, but we're glad to see people trying it. Do you think it has real momentum?
I don't see any momentum,
Okay.
but it should, right?
Yeah.
I think people take to it like ducks to water,
Yeah.
it's a return to a more natural kind of life, right? I mean, we have forgotten how artificial it is to have this thing, to walk around staring at the palm of our hand all day long. That it seems mandatory now, but it's so unnatural and so recent that to be returned to our senses, I think is something that that certainly could take off when people have had enough.
Yeah.
Enough
It's a good place to start.
Yeah.
Yeah. Because I think, when your book comes out, people ask you presumably kind of a lot about that too, right?
Yeah. I think that's right. I mean, so the last chapter is kind of about both an aesthetics and an ethics of this kind of renunciation of, or the attempt to move away from idolatry anyway. And I think both of those, it can't just be an aesthetic thing.
No, right.
It can't just be the way, our sensibilities are, but it has to also be an ethical thing. It has to be, an attention to people that suffer from the kind of idolatrous systems that we support and create.
Yeah. Can you say a little bit about like, and I think you do unpack this in your book, but we want to train people to see God in things, but not to make a God of things, right? So for Coventry Patmore, the basic sacramental thing would be, a woman. A woman is more than a woman. A loaf of bread is more than a loaf of bread. Do you think there's things, Bill, that just aren't capable of that? And in your book, do you kind of like separate these things? That these things that have no poetry behind them.
Are there things in life that have no poetry behind them?
Yeah, I think so. I
Yes.
think there is. Okay. Yeah, for sure.
Yeah, for sure. For sure. Yeah.
How do you go about training young people to make these distinctions?
I mean, you just show them things that have poetry in them, and so people recognize what's good.
Yeah. Overlaps a lot with your project, don't you think, Michael?
It certainly does.
Very, very closely. So, Bill, can't thank you enough. Again, your unassuming manner, which is the opposite of boring, I think kind of it hides the fact that
sometimes it's not. Sometimes I'm just plain boring.
It hides the fact of how radical and consistent and quite a revolutionary body of work that you have. Again, I think you're lighting dynamite with every book you do, and so glad you could join us. Would you be willing to join us again when your book comes out? We'd like to showcase it.
I would be delighted to. No, this is really fun. Thanks, guys.
Thank you.
Conversation.
Okay, great. And thanks everybody for listening to the Regeneration Podcast. We will keep on lining up these great guests, and we'll see everybody again next week.